and arose on Sunday. Well, such words would be natural for us to say, but they are no more found in the Scriptures than would be this phrase, and the evening and the morning were the fourth day, Wednesday. We don't find days of the week named in the Bible. Most of those names that we use did not originate until the 10th century. The Saxons' days were Sun's Day, Moon's Day, Tuesday, and that's spelled T-I-W. I'm not really sure how you would pronounce that, but it sounds good. Woden's Day, Thor's Day, Frigg's Day, and Saturn's Day. The Romans did have names for the days of the week, but they're not found in the Scriptures, and so did the Greeks. The Romans called the first day Dies Solis, meaning the day of the sun, and that was followed by Dies Lunae, the day of the moon. And then they had Martis, Mercury, Jovis, Veneris, and Saturni. We, again, do not find any of these names. We always find the first day, second day, and so forth in the Scriptures, with the exception of the seventh day, which does have a name, and is called the Sabbath. Maxie asked me to say a few words about these, and this doesn't really have anything to do with the topic, but I just couldn't help wondering if we were still using those numbers, what some of our popular songs in recent years would sound like. Imagine Spanky and our gang singing, "First Days Will Never Be the Same." Or the mamas and the papas hurrying to repeat the phrase in their number one hit, "Second day, second day." And then there's the Bangles, and their alliteration would be lost. It's just another manic second day. The Moody Blues might sound slightly awkward with third day afternoon, but the Rolling Stones' Ruby Third Day, somebody might mistake as a tribute to a Native American. Chicago might make out fairly well with Seventh Day in the Park, but the Bay City Rollers would have too many letters to spell out for SEVENTHDAY night. Well, that's about the only thing humorous about this topic that we have today, and I appreciated some of Dan's remarks yesterday. I'm willing to donate a book to the Dolphins library that he talked about yesterday. I thought they might enjoy 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But this topic is really a very serious topic. People are, as Maxie said, claiming that the seventh day is binding upon mankind today. Not only do they say that it is binding today, they claim that it has always been binding upon mankind, and we want to take some time this morning to refute that idea. We do learn in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 2 that on the seventh day, God rested from the work he had done. But it is not until 2,000 years later that we find a commandment concerning that seventh day. If you have a Bible, or this is also in the book, Exodus chapter 16, beginning with verse 23. We'd like to read just down through verse 30 and get the whole flavor of this. You will see as we read this that the seventh day is instituted in connection, first of all, with the manna, and then just a few chapters later, it's one of the 10 Commandments. So Exodus 16:23 is the first mention. And he said unto them, "This is that which the Lord hath said, tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which you will bake today, and seethe that you will seethe, and that which remaineth over lay up for you to be kept until the morning." And they laid it up until the morning, as Moses bade, and it did not stink, neither was there any worm therein. And Moses said, "Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today ye shall not find it in the field. 6 days ye shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none." And it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the seventh day for to gather, and they found none. They had a hard time taking God at his word sometimes. And it came to pass that they found none, verse 27, and then verse 28, the Lord said unto Moses, "How long refuse you to keep my commandments and my laws?" See, for the Lord hath given you the Sabbath, therefore he hath given you the 6th day, the bread of 2 days. Abide ye every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. So the people rested on the 7th day. So the Sabbath then is introduced in connection, first of all, with God's providing manna for the people. He had delivered them out of Egypt. He had led them through the Red Sea. They were now in the wilderness. And of course, there had to be some way to feed such a great multitude. So God provided the manna from heaven to feed them. But as he does so, he says, I want you to gather twice as much on the 6th day, and then not go out and gather it, because there won't be any on the 7th day. Now, as we look at that, the Israelites had obviously not been observing a 7th day up until this time, or God's instructions would not have needed to be so detailed on this point. He would have said, as always, there will be no work on the 7th day. But of course that is not said. Instead, he gives Israel a lengthy explanation for avoiding work on the Sabbath. The next mention of the Sabbath is in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8, in which God tells Israel to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. He again gives the specific intent of the day. 6 days shalt thou labor and do thy works, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt do no work. Verses 9 and 10 also. Knowing man's propensity to try to get around commandments, God not only forbade the head of the house to work, he also said nobody else in the family could work. Well, I can just see somebody saying, yeah, but I'm losing money. Surely my servants could work. And the answer is no, servants are not to do any work on that day either. And in the event that some ingenious soul trains his animals to work without him, that ploy is likewise forbidden. Can't do that either. Well, God knew that in the future there would be non-Jews living among the people. And, naturally somebody would say, well, look, these people are not under our covenant. These people are not Jews. There's no reason why they can't work on the Sabbath. So God includes them too, stranger in the land. Even Gentiles are prohibited from working on the 7th day if they are in Israel. Now, the point is that nobody does any work on this way. They're not man, not woman, not animals, not servants, not strangers. Nobody. This is to be a day of rest. God cites a precedent for this commandment, his own pattern and day of rest after the 6 days of creation, as we already mentioned, Genesis chapter 2 and verse 2. For the Israelites, God had now set aside the 7th day as a day of rest. The Sabbath day was dedicated for that specific purpose. And so it was to be exactly what God intended it to be, a day of rest. To work on this day would be to defile its intent and to disobey God. Now, you may have noticed in the passages that we've already read, there was no penalty ascribed for violating the Sabbath day. They were told, remember to keep it holy, but there's no penalty attached. So at a later time, God did attach a penalty for violating this day. In Exodus chapter 35 and verse 2, we read, whosoever doeth work therein shall be put to death. And that included even such a little matter as kindling a fire. Exodus 35 and verse 3. Later, a man stopped short of even kindling the fire. But he, too, suffered consequences. He was just out gathering sticks. And I don't know whether his intent was to go ahead and then use them for a fire, or maybe he just thought he'd get a jump on the next day. I don't know. But whatever, when God was asked for his judgment in the matter, he told Moses, the man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones without the camp. Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 through 36. A day of rest meant exactly that. Even chores that required very little effort, minimal effort, are condemned. Even the usual tasks of fixing a meal cannot be done if they require preparation, such as going out and gathering manna. There is one other dimension of the Sabbath that is also revealed in the book of Exodus, and we want to take a look at that from chapter 31, beginning with verse 12. Exodus chapter 31, beginning with verse 12. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak thou unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbath shall ye keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord that does sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath therefore, for it is holy unto you. Every one that defileth it shall surely be put to death. For whosoever doth any work on that day, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days may work be done, but the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whosoever doeth any work in the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh he rested and was refreshed. Now, you might say, well, why belabor this? Well, of course it's in the book, and God thought it was important enough to repeat, but it also is going to come in handy later on when we talk about those who want to bind the Sabbath day on others. If we don't say it again, think of it now. Do you realize what keeping the Sabbath day means? If you really think the Sabbath day should be honored today, then there cannot be any work whatsoever. Cannot do anything. Otherwise, the penalty would be being put to death. So if you really want to argue that the Sabbath day should be kept, we need to understand what God required of Israel when he gave the commandment. But a second thing we want to notice from this passage in particular is that it was a sign between God and his people, Israel. The Sabbath, in addition to being part of the Ten Commandments, serves as a sign between the two, God and Israel. It's not between God and all nations. It's between God and one nation. The generation privileged to receive God's law perished in the wilderness. When these teachings were repeated to the next generation, the Sabbath day is still to be sanctified. It is still to be made holy. God didn't change his mind because of one disobedient generation. He required the same thing of the next generation. And all of those things, including the part about people and animals resting, is found in Deuteronomy 5, verses 12 through 14. The death penalty portion is not repeated here, but the man stoned to death in Numbers 15, I'm sure that was still upon the minds of the younger generation at the time that they went into the land. One additional reason is added for revering the seventh day. Israel had been servants in Egypt, but God had delivered them with a mighty hand. So Deuteronomy 5:15 cites that. The Sabbath day is also in honor of their deliverance out of Egypt. Down there, they probably hadn't had a day of rest. God wanted to remind them of that. Under my covenant, you don't have to work every day. You get a day of rest. But I mean it to be exactly that, a day of rest. So having looked at all of the pertinent passages that we find in the Pentateuch on this subject, let's summarize what we have seen thus far. Number one, the Sabbath day was to be a day in which both people and animals, servants, strangers, everybody rested. Number two, the work from which Israel was to abstain included even such simple tasks as gathering manna, gathering sticks, or kindling a fire. Number three, when this precept was violated, the transgressor was stoned. Number four, the day was to be sanctified by Israel. It was to be kept holy. Number five, God assigns reasons for this commandment. God doesn't always tell reasons why he gives commandments, but he did in this case. And they were, first, that he himself during the creation week had worked 6 days and rested on the seventh. And so he commands them to rest on the seventh day to imitate his pattern. Second, it serves as a sign between God and Israel forever. And third, it serves as a memorial to Israel's deliverance out of Egypt. So that's what we have seen as we look through the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Now, it might prove helpful to notice what we did not see as we read all of those passages. Number one, we did not learn that God commanded Adam and Eve to observe the Sabbath. On the day that he created them, he did not say, now look, I brought you into existence and I have created you, but I've been working for 6 days and tomorrow we're all going to rest. He didn't say that to Adam and Eve. In fact, it would have only been their second day. They wouldn't have had a need to rest yet. No mention is made during the patriarchal system of anyone observing the Sabbath. Noah is not said to have observed it. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, no one. It's not mentioned in connection with them anywhere. God instructs Israel concerning the day when they get into the wilderness as though they are unfamiliar with it. And the reason they were unfamiliar with it is because it had never been commanded. Furthermore, Nehemiah corroborates this deduction when, in summarizing the key events of Israel's history, he says that God came down and spoke to Israel at Sinai and made known his holy Sabbath. He made it known. You'd only make known what is not known. Number two, there is no mention of any kind of gathering on the Sabbath day. In all the passages that discuss the subject, there is not one allusion to the Israelites gathering together with others in their city to meet and worship God. In the wilderness, all the tribes were together, and a worship assembly would have been easy to arrange, but we did not see any instructions concerning worship on that day. Once God gave them the land and they were scattered throughout it, it would have been much harder for the whole congregation to get together, but it wouldn't have been hard. Initially, they were all camped near each other. So nothing indicates that worship assemblies were required for the Israelites as we're required to worship on the first day of the week. In other words, we're saying those two things are not parallel. They're often judged as parallel, and later on, Israel did take advantage of the Sabbath day to meet and to worship, but it wasn't commanded and it wasn't practiced, as we find in the first 5 books of the Bible. Number 3, we did not read that God made the Sabbath day as a sign of his covenant with Gentiles or any other nation in particular. Both Isaiah and Ezekiel, not to mention Amos, pronounce woes upon several nations. If you studied Isaiah or Jeremiah, Ezekiel, any of the other prophets, you know that a large portion of the book is devoted to pronouncing condemnation on those nations for their sins. But never once was a Gentile nation rebuked for violating the Sabbath day. Can anyone seriously imagine that these idolatrous and immoral nations somehow all scrupulously kept the Sabbath day while violating every other commandment of God? That would be a stretch for even the most bizarre fiction writer to come up with. They didn't have the commandment. If they'd have had it, we're confident they would have violated it like they did everything else. But God didn't give that commandment to anyone but Israel. Let's talk now about one of the key arguments of the Seventh-day Adventists in regard to why they think everybody should keep the Sabbath. They make an argument on the word forever. And we did read that word in some of the passages we looked at. And some have thought then, since the word forever was used in connection with keeping the Sabbath, it should still be observed today. Well, if that were a proper conclusion, notice that these following commandments I'm going to give would also be observed today. There would be no work on the Sabbath day, as we mentioned before. There would be a penalty for violating the Sabbath day, death. And it would be a day for everybody to remember that God had delivered Israel out of Egypt. Which brings us to an interesting problem. Most of us are Gentiles and not Jews. Why would we need to be remembering that today? We were never and are not now under that commandment. Only the Jews and a few proselytes and those who came to live in the land were under that law. The main argument used to bind the Sabbath upon people today, to attempt to bind it, involves the use of the word forever. Does its use in Exodus 31:17 require observance in our age? There are two things wrong with that notion. First of all, forever does not mean until the end of the world or throughout eternity in the Old Testament. And we'll look at that more closely in a moment. Second, the law that included the Sabbath observance has been nailed to the cross. And we'll look at that a little more closely later on. First of all, the word forever. James D. Bales, in his usual thorough manner, listed a number of items that were to be forever that are mentioned in the Old Testament. These things were to be forever, everlastingly, or throughout their generations. Well, let's take a look very quickly. The two that we're most concerned with besides the Sabbath day are circumcision and the Passover. In the covenant of circumcision, which actually predated the law, was given to Abraham, but it was incorporated into the law, Leviticus chapter 12 and verse 3. God told Abraham, "He that is born in thy house and he that is bought with thy money must needs be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant." Genesis 17:13. Then let's notice the Passover. At the time of its institution, it was designated as something that you would keep forever. "And this day shall be unto you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast of the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an ordinance forever." Exodus 12:14. Now, those are the ones we're most interested in, but let me quickly read the list of the other things that forever is said about in the Old Testament. God required a continual burnt offering throughout all generations, Exodus 29:42. God required a perpetual incense before him throughout their generations, Exodus 30 and verse 8. When the priests entered into the tabernacle, God required that they wash their hands and feet. That statute was forever to them, even to him and to his seed throughout their generations, Exodus 30 verses 20 and 21. The penalty for failure to observe that commandment, by the way, also was death. Number 6, the statute governing Aaron's male descendants partaking of the meat or meal offering was forever in their generations, Leviticus 6:18. More regulations concerning the meal offering were also to be kept throughout their generations, Leviticus 23, verses 13 and 14. The Day of Atonement, number 7, with its various regulations, was to be kept forever. The Day of Atonement kept forever throughout their generations, Leviticus 23, verses 27 through 32. Number 8, the Feast of Tabernacles, the ingathering, with its specific instructions, was to be kept forever in their generations, Leviticus 23, 33 through 43. Number 9, throughout their generations, the children of Israel were to make fringes on the borders of their garments, Numbers 15:38, and number 10, in the midst of all of these is the Sabbath day, which was to be kept for a perpetual covenant. So we have the same basic terminology used, or similar words used, in every one of these 10 items. What does that mean? Well, that means if you're going to go back to take one of those 10 and say, look, the word forever. Word forever's there. That means we got to do it today, and you got to go back and get the other 9 because they all say the same thing. You can't just pick one unless you have a very biased way of interpreting the Scriptures. They either all go or none of them goes. Well, some of those are said to be no longer in effect, and that's due to the law having been nailed to the cross. But it's said that some of these are not in effect specifically. Responding to the problems caused by Judaizing teachers, Paul wrote in Galatians 6:15, "For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision availeth anything, nor uncircumcision, but a new creature." Now think about that. This goes back even prior to the Sabbath day, because this covenant was made with Abraham long before the 10 Commandments were given, including the Sabbath. No indication even that Abraham ever kept something called the Sabbath. So here's something even much older than that, something which also is to be forever. And Paul says it doesn't matter anymore. In Christ, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything. In other words, it's no longer a requirement upon anyone religiously, not circumcision. The law of Moses was not to be bound upon Gentiles, which, by the way, is a large purpose for the book of Galatians being written. And in the Jerusalem conference in Acts chapter 15, called to deal with this specific issue, circumcision is not one of the 4 items repeated from the law which Gentiles would have to obey. Neither is the Sabbath day. There is no mention of the Sabbath day as being bound upon Christians in Acts 15 or anywhere else. Nowhere is the Passover bound upon Christians. In fact, Paul wrote, "For even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us." 1 Corinthians 5:7. The law of Moses had been replaced by the perfect law of liberty, the New Testament of Jesus Christ. We have a new and different covenant. That old covenant, which includes the Sabbath, is gone. And so are circumcision, and so are keeping the Passover, and the other 7 items that we listed from the Old Testament. For that reason, Christians, whether Jew or Gentile, are not commanded to keep the Sabbath, the Passover, or the venerable tradition of circumcision. If even one item were said to last forever, and it is clearly no longer bound, then every one of those items quickly becomes vulnerable. If any one item is said to last forever, and we see in the New Testament is no longer binding, then there goes the argument on the word forever. Forever. That argument goes. Along these lines, any person who would select an Old Testament item and try to make it part of the New Covenant without it being explicitly taught in the New Testament then must obligate himself to keep the whole law. Not only those 10 items, but all items from the Old Testament must be brought over if we're going to pick any one. Notice Paul's argument on this in Galatians 5:3. "For I testify again to every man that is circumcised that he is a debtor to do the whole law." Paul says you can't even bring over one item without bringing it all over with you. And so even if we didn't have all of this other information, which we do, we would still not be able to bring the Sabbath day over unless we were willing to bring over the whole thing. And then guess what? If we successfully do that, Paul says you've fallen from grace. Galatians 5:4. You cannot go back to the law and try to bind it upon people today, or you have fallen from grace. Now, what about those words? The words translated forever or things related to that. Dan Winkler comments, "The Sabbath is described as a sign forever, the Hebrew word olam, long duration. Olam carries the idea which lasts its allotted amount of time. And many others have commented on the word olam. What is the explanation, one writes? How could they be forever and yet end? Throughout your generations and forever were both expressions frequently used with reference to an existing dispensation or to a limited period. It does not always signify eternity, but a long time. Forever was sometimes limited by the nature of the thing to which it referred. The slave referred to his master forever, or served his master forever, even though his slavery ended with death. But he is said to serve him forever. But even without any word studies to tell us the limitations of the word forever in the Hebrew, the very fact that some of the 10 items that were said to be perpetual have been in fact eradicated proves that they were only to be age-lasting rather than eternal. That age, throughout their generations, that has come to an end. The law was nailed to the cross. In the book we have a treatment of Matthew 5:17 and 18, and Ephesians 2:14 through 16, and Colossians 2:14 that we're not going to be able to cover at this time. But we do want to point out that the conclusion is that the law of Moses was given to the Israelites, and that law has been taken and nailed to the cross. It is no longer binding. Now that leads people to ask the question, well, And some people look lost like a little puppy dog. And, well, what are we under then? Well, have you not read there's an Old Testament and a New Testament? There's an Old Covenant and a New Covenant. We're not under the Old Covenant. We're under the New Covenant. We are now subject to the perfect law of liberty, James chapter 1 and verse 25. Jesus began teaching the principles of the New Covenant, which are now in force, and his apostles completed what he began. The new system includes the blood of Christ, which continues to cleanse his followers as they walk in the light, 1 John 1, 7 through 9. Many moral principles which were in the law are repeated, although frequently they are amplified. Consider Matthew 5, beginning with about verse 21, to see how Jesus makes them even greater than what they were before, more comprehensive than they were before. But many of the ordinances in the law are not repeated in the New Testament. We don't have circumcision, we don't have Passover, we don't have fringes on our garments, we don't have any of the other things we talked about, and we are not bound by a Sabbath day either. In Hebrews chapter 8, verses 6 and 7, we read that if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no place sought for the second. That first covenant could not do what God ultimately had in mind. So many of it was a type, much of it was a type of what would come. And the New Testament completely takes care of sin and gives salvation unto mankind. That's why it's a greater covenant. It's a better one. That covenant did not take place until after Jesus' death, however, in Hebrews 9, verses 15 through 17. Now, Christians do not keep the Sabbath day because we're not authorized to keep it. Whatever you do and whatever you teach, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Colossians 3:17, we have no authority. There is nothing that authorizes us to observe the Sabbath day. It's not found in the New Testament. Now, there is an example of an apostle meeting on the seventh day with Jews, but as you read those accounts in the book of Acts, what do you find? He was not keeping the Sabbath day as a religious observance. He was using it as an opportunity to teach. He never once commanded brethren to keep the Sabbath in any of his writings. He never implied that they should. It's just simply not there. There is one mention of the Sabbath day after the book of Acts, and that's in Colossians, and it's not favorable to keeping the Sabbath day, and in fact, it's the exact opposite. Sabbath keeping is not part of the new covenant. It is not one of the four things that are bound upon us in Acts 15. There is not any reason to think that we ought to keep the Sabbath day. Now, let's talk about the Sabbath day versus the first day of the week. The Armstrongs, Seventh-day Adventists, led by Ellen G. White, who lived from 1827 to 1915. She was the prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventists, made her feelings plain about the Sabbath day. I don't think you could say this in any stronger terms, and you cannot misunderstand what she is saying. Quote, Sunday keeping is the mark of the beast. And at the coming of Jesus, which is just at hand, every soul keeping Sunday will be lost. I don't know how you could improve on plainness in that. Well, in the first place, the coming of Jesus was not at hand when Mrs. White made this statement, thus making her a false prophetess. 62 world wars have elapsed since she made this statement. Airplanes and automobiles have proliferated, especially coming here this morning. Ships that can take us to the moon have been devised, along with shuttles that fly through space and land on stations that orbit the earth. The Iron Curtain hadn't even been erected at the time that she made this statement, and now it's fallen. All of these things since she said, oh, it's at hand. Well, it was not at hand. Second, if she means by Sunday keeping that Christians observe the first day of the week the way Israelites observe the seventh day, she is way off base. Christians do not have a Sabbath day. We do not have a Sabbath day. God did not command us to rest one day out of 7. He commanded us to meet and worship Him on the Lord's day. And the two are not equal, but in the minds of many, they are. And especially probably in her mind it was. The Lord's day is not a day of rest, as the Sabbath was. The Sabbath day was not designed as a day of worship, which the Lord's day is. Now, why do Christians keep the first day of the week? Well, we have a section in the book we're not going to be able to cover about her claim that the Catholic Church changed the day, but that is ludicrous. There is plenty of evidence to show that that is not true, but we're not going to have time to cover all that. But the origin of Christians assembling on the first day of the week lies in the New Testament itself. It's not something that some men dreamed up or some apostate religion instituted. The day that we are observing as Christians is found right here in the Bible. We don't have to go to secular history to find that day being instituted. Now, is there a command that specifically says, thou shalt worship on the first day of the week? Not exactly in those terms, but the Bible authorizes things in more ways than just a direct statement, such as example and such as not only direct statements, but also implication. Much of what we do is by implication, and there's nothing wrong with implication. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 41, we read that immediately upon being baptized, and in verse 42, that they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and in fellowship and in breaking of bread and in prayers. They immediately began meeting on the day that God wanted them to meet on. We might ask, well, why is there not much made about what day people should meet on in the Bible? Well, it's very simple. They started out right and they didn't change it. You don't have to command somebody to do something they're already doing. They got off to the right start. There's no question about that. And so there's not much said about it. However, there are some things that are said about it. And again, we haven't the time to go into all of the arguments, but you want to look at 1 Corinthians 11:20 and other passages in Corinthians that show that they had a day when they were meeting. You want to consider Hebrews 10:25, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. There was a time when they were assembling. When was that time? Well, you go to passages like 1 Corinthians 16:2, and you find out that on that day they were to lay aside an offering for God. You find that when Paul was in a hurry to get to Jerusalem by Pentecost, Acts 20 and verse 16, that he took time to meet with some disciples, and he waited 6 days until the first day of the week, Acts chapter 20 and verse 7. You look at all of these things and you see that there is one day that Christians are to observe, and it is not the Sabbath day, it is the Lord's day. So when we put all of those things together, we see Acts 20 and verse 7, 1 Corinthians 16:2, other passages in 1 Corinthians about the day, about the assembly. Then we also realize this. What day was it that Jesus arose from the dead? First day of the week. He made an appearance to his disciples on that day. When was the next time he made an appearance? First day of the week. When was the church begun? First day of the week. John said, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, 1 John 1:9. Tell me, what occurred on the Sabbath? What significant events occurred on the Sabbath? Jesus was in the tomb on that day. He didn't arise till the next day, the first day of the week. Seventh-day Adventists may say, well, you know, there's not a lot of commandments. There's not a lot written in the New Testament about the first day of the week. Well, there's a whole lot more than there is about the Sabbath. We have all of those passages that we have mentioned. There is plenty of evidence for Christians to understand that we worship on the first day of the week, and there is no evidence. If there was, believe me, Seventh-day Adventists were trotted out. But in all the debates we've had over the years, they have not come up with anything. There is no evidence for Christians worshiping on a Sabbath day. We have a biblical authority to worship on the first day of the week, and we need to respect that biblical authority and do what the apostles and our brethren did in the first century.